Hello, it's me again. We're going to talk to you about 4 sets of trade-offs in international trade policy. And here they are. We're going to talk about the impact of UK trade policy on the rest of the world. That's the rest of this evening. Balancing trade between territories and sectors of the UK economy, about privacy and data, and about food and the environment. And then in the final Saturday in February, we're going to try and pull it all together with you in the face-to-face sessions. What I want to do in this very first session, however, is to place this in a little bit of context by giving you a few facts about international trade in the UK itself. Why do we do that? Well, we need to know what's big, what's small, who we're dealing with, and so on. Now, the UK economy is very dependent on trade. Imports account for something like 24% of the consumption and investment that goes on in the UK. And as you'll see later, imports provide really key inputs into the production process. They're an important part of productivity of the UK economy is being able to use equipment and bits that come from the rest of the world. The other side of the account in international trade is exports. Exports provide about 24% of the demand for the UK's output, and we reckon that they support something like 6.5 million jobs. But if trade is big for the UK is not that big for trade anymore. In this little map, I've shown you the shares of the markets in each of several countries that UK accounts for in both total of goods and services. In the countries we're close to and we are friends with, USA, EU, South Africa, Australia, we are getting around 5% of their markets. But in the big emerging markets, Brazil, India, China, the UK gets less than 2%. In other words, the UK is not really big enough to scare anybody in terms of their behaviour. And that's important when you think about what we might be able to do so far as using trade as an instrument to influence the rest of the world. Now, just to look at the UK trade in total, here's a little graph run from 2000 to 2021. It shows total imports of goods and total exports of goods. Imports quite a lot higher than exports. That's a trade deficit in goods. Both series tend to arise but wobble a bit, with reductions in the obvious crises like the financial crisis and the pandemic. Now, if I add services, I want to point out a couple of differences between services and goods. First, services are growing faster. They started much lower than trade in goods in 2000, yet approached in exports case of caught up. They're much smoother. They don't fluctuate as much. And very interestingly, exports of services now are basically the same level as exports of goods. The UK is very unusual among big economies in that respect. We really do specialise on services much more than most big and rich economies. There's a surplus on services. We export more than we import, but the surplus that we earn on services is not enough to cover the deficit on goods. And the result is that we have to borrow abroad or sell assets in order to finance the difference between what we spend on imports and what we earn through exports. This difference, the importance of services, is going to show up in all of the sessions that we have in the rest of this exercise. So who does the UK trade with and what do we trade? Well, I'm going to start again with services, actually. You consider this: exports on the right in blue, imports on the left in yellow, just reporting how much trade we had in those categories in 2019, the last year that I think is not distorted by the pandemic. You'll notice that we have a surplus in every one of these categories of services trade, except for travel and culture, and that's mostly the difference is UK citizens' strong propensity to go abroad for holidays. Look at the bottom two, financial services and other business services, things like lawyers and architects. very strong exports, very big sectors, very important parts of the British economy. Exports far exceed imports. Britain's very competitive in these sectors. Let me also point out the second and third bars in this diagram. Intellectual property, that's sort of licensing things like music and technology, and also telecommunications, computer information services, sort of the modern end of the economy. The UK is also very competitive in these areas, and exports exceed imports. The importance of those sectors is going to be really highlighted in the third of our sessions on data and privacy. Data is really the bedrock of most services trade. Now, if we turn to goods, broken up here into sort of broad categories: basic materials, iron ore, foods, semi-manufactured goods, iron rods, separated out oil, chemicals. But look at the bottom, the really dominant category is finished manufactures. This is a feature actually for many countries. It's not just a uniquely UK position. What's in those finished manufactures? Well, here we've got them broken up into 5 categories. Ships and aircraft. Exports here do exceed imports, but we have quite a strong aerospace sector. But goods in that sector tend to both be imported and exported. We're really dependent on links with the rest of the world. Motor cars, two-way trade, as we've seen in the video that we showed you, different varieties. The UK exports Natcen's, imports BMWs and so on. Roughly balanced trade. The other 3 bars have got the rest of goods broken up into consumer goods: iPhones, washing machines; capital goods, big bits of kit like industrial boilers or railway locomotives; and intermediate goods, the goods that enter into the production of other goods. The UK is a net importer. Imports exceed exports in all of these cases. But look how important the last 2 are: capital goods and intermediate goods. You and I don't consume those. They're critical for industry. British industry does import a lot of what it needs from abroad as part of its productivity. So who do we trade with? I've got a diagram here that's going to look at the share of UK imports going to each continent and the share of UK exports going to each continent. Start off with Australasia. Australia, basically, very small, 1% of UK imports, 2% nearly of UK exports. Africa, 54 countries in Africa, but very poor. 2.5% of UK trade is with Africa. The Americas, about 15% of our imports come from America, 24% of our exports. This is largely trade with the USA, and in trade with the USA, services are very important. Next comes Asia, get over 20% of both exports and imports. Big partners here are China and Japan, India and South Korea coming along shortly afterwards. But the real champion in terms of the amount of trade is Europe. In 2019, 60% of imports came from the whole of Europe. That's nearly all from the EU, but a few other countries around the edges, and 50% of exports went to Europe. So the big one is Europe. But if you think that's surprising, look at this diagram where we just look explicitly at food and live animals exports. Here we've got the EU broken out at the bottom. And in terms of food, basically what this category is, the EU is absolutely our dominant source of imports, and by a long, long way, our biggest export market. In other words, if you're worrying about food, which we'll be doing in session 4, Europe, frankly, is the trading partner we need to consider. Before I finish, I just want to say one word about trade policy, but of course you'll come across lots more of that as we go on. International trade is costly, and I want you to sort of discover this by imagining that you need to buy a bit of kit for your company, a fancy computer or a fancy metal stamping machine. If you buy it within the EU, the UK, you need to find someone to supply it. You need to make sure it does the job you require. You need to arrange to transport it and insure it, and you need to pay VAT on the transaction. But if you want to buy it from abroad, you have to do all of those things, and they'll generally cost you a bit more. But in addition, you also have to make sure that it meets UK regulations, pay for it in foreign currency, get it through customs in both places, forms and time, and pay the tariff due at the border. The tariff is just a tax on imports as they come into the country. Now, trade policy ought to try and make easier and reduce the costs of all the steps at the bottom of the previous slide. Free trade agreements, which we talk a lot about in the UK, the government keeps going on about them and tries to sign them, actually only typically abolish tariffs. And even then, they only abolish tariffs subject to a condition that the exporter can prove the good was actually produced in our partner country in the free trade agreement, not just transported via it. Now, many recent FTAs also include a few steps to ease regulations, like allowing in goods that meet your partner's regulations, or making it easier to certify that partner goods satisfy your own regulations. The deepest of all trade agreements, the European Union, has gone so far as to abolish the rules of origin and border formalities and make trans-border services trade a lot easier. But it's very rare. There really is only one agreement in the world that has gone that far. So that's in context, all from me. So thanks very much for listening if you have been, and I'll hand you back to Kieran now. So thank you.